We have Camila Camara. Camila you're doing your master PhD. She's doing her master's at HafenCity University, supervised by Catherine. So Camila is going to give a talk on local action for climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, a case study for São Paulo.
Okay. Okay. So good morning or afternoon, everyone. I'm trying to try to be quick. I'll stick to my notes. I apologize for not being as accomplished as the others because I tend to talk about other things and lose focus. So I'll try to stick to this one. Anyways, today I'm going to talk about actions towards climate change, mitigation, and adaptation for the city scale. It's a study on the municipality of São Paulo. In 2014, the IPCC identified not only that the cities are vulnerable to climate change, but also that they may contribute more to the effect itself. It's quite intuitive. You have larger urban incomes, so they will have a higher energy consumption. So since we didn't decouple energy consumption and emissions yet, it will lead to climate change, more emissions. So if you see this graphic, we have more than half of the world as a mostly urban population since the early 2000s. And in Brazil, we are mostly urban since the early 60s. So yeah, we should be worrying about it. And even though it is a global effect, you still cannot say that it affects every place in the same manner. I think it was even touched in one of the questions. So the way a specific place is affected by climate change will depend on how the climate is in the place, what is the economy, sometimes even the culture, location, everything. So especially in a place like Brazil, in which we are occupying almost the whole continent, it's impossible to generalize. Some classic examples of how climate change may affect would be the urban heat island effect becoming worse because of temperature rise, or flooding, and even water scarcity because, okay, it may rain more, but sometimes this rain is more concentrated at some times. So I think we suffer both problems here. We have some times with no rains at all and a lot of rain happening at the same time. And it has become worse and worse with time. So anyways, it will depend. So as I said in the beginning, today's focus will be the city of São Paulo, where we are right now. It is a very good example, not only because of its size, it has the highest GDP in Brazil and also the highest population, but also it started to address the problem really early. So it's interesting to see how much we evolved in terms of climate change policies in the last decade. Okay, so we'll try to understand this and see what we learn and what maybe we should try to further develop. So to also help you understand the importance of seeing the different scales, this is the distributions of emissions in the national scale, the state scale, and the municipality. So if you check the national scale, we have the biggest problem with agriculture and forestries. Basically, we are taking out our trees to have more agricultural and livestock. And in the municipality, it doesn't even show up. The major problem is really transportation, as we saw in the air pollution presentations. I think both problems are very closely related. So we'll try to take a look of this context first of the national legislation and policies, the state one, and then go to the municipalities so that we can see how they work together and how they support each other. So this is just a brief timeline of how things came up in terms of policies and legislation. It's not all there is. A lot of other reports and strategies came from each of these plans, policies, and guidelines, but this is pretty much the main one. So we can start by looking at the bigger picture with the national scale. So we'll start with the national policy on climate change. So in the end of 2007, an interministerial committee on climate change was created to elaborate both a national policy, that I'm going to talk about first, and a national plan. So the national policy was drafted in 2008, enacted in 2009, and it specified the objectives, principles, guidelines, and instruments for climate change mitigation. So it basically tells how the country is approaching the problem. How are we going to treat it? So it institutes the country's voluntary commitment in reducing the projected emissions in something between approximately 36 to 39% in 2020 in relation to 2005 here. It's a very good step if you think about it. It's 36 to 39% is a lot, so very ambitious. So even though this policy mentions a lot of instruments, especially when talking about deforestation, there's not really some specific action proposition in it. And I think my greatest iffy aspect with this document is how it reinforces this voluntary idea. So every time it says, so it's a voluntary commitment, and it gives a bit of an impression that, yeah, I'm doing more than my obligation already. So if we do it, we did it. If we don't, but that's my impression. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an architect. So this is all I can talk about in these terms, how I feel by reading it. So now the national plan. So it works within the same framework as the national policy, but I think it has some more specific guidelines. And also it came up with a more sectorial view and produced sectorial plans. So for example, there's an actual plan for prevention and control of the legal Amazon deforestation, or the low carbon agriculture plan, also the 10-year energy plan is part of what came out from it. So there's an emphasis on synergistic solutions, which is amazing. We want synergistic solutions, but we need to know that it won't always be possible. So I think that's pretty much the problem with the voluntary idea. When it's not only the voluntary idea, but when it's part of other things, sometimes we lose focus of this. And as I think Andrea mentioned, it's a matter of survival. If we don't take care of it, then it will become something that we can take care of anymore. Let's see if I... oh, okay, something else interesting about this one is that it talks a lot about climate change mitigation as an opportunity for sustainable development. So it talks a lot about how to use this in our favor. And this part, I think it's really nice. So finally, we have, still on the federation scale, the most recent edition, the National Adaptation Plan. This is from 2016. I think it's really interesting that now we are starting to talk about adaptation in the national scale. So the text corroborates this necessity to adapt and also talk about specific strategies to climate change in adaptation in cities. So it says that the climate variability already poses a significant challenge and that future climate change seems inevitable. So this makes it imperative to develop strategies for adaptation in view of the issues of ethical and social justice this entails. So it's already talking about the city scale. Of course, it can't be very specific because it's talking about a huge country with a lot of different characteristics. But still, it can be an opener for the state scale and maybe the municipality scales to start thinking about these strategies. Finally, this is the last for the national one. We have done a lot nationally, that's nice. We have the Brazilian Panel on Climate Change. It's an organ, It was created by the Ministries of Science and Technology and of the environment, sorry, and it's based on the IPCC. So the idea of the Brazilian Panel on Climate Change is informing. So it gives technical and scientific information, produces reports and so on to make sure that researchers and everyone gets to know what's being done about it and how to build policies based on this scientific information. So this is really nice. The sad part is until I had to make this research, I've never heard of anything of that. So I don't know if like my mom, she probably doesn't know what climate change is. I'll make sure to ask, but I don't know if the everyday person would know what we are talking about. So just so you can have an idea of the actual results we reached with that. Okay, from 2005, there was a reduction, but curiously, from when we enacted the first policy here in 2009, not so good. But yeah, but we're gonna go through this. I mean, this sort of thing kind of brings a little bit of hope that we are going to change the situation. Okay. Oh yeah, just a comment. Even though we don't see this much positive result yet, it doesn't mean that legislation is meaningless. It's not. It's very important. It just means we need to keep on working on them to make them more effective and make better strategies and make things, go on in a better way. So that's just the message at this point. So now we go to the state level analysis. So curiously, the state policy was published before the enactment of the national law. It was in the same year. They both follow the same structure, but the state presents more practical instruments to gather information, and it commits to a reduction of 20% by 2020. So it's less than the national level. It's not the same objective for some reason, but it has it there. To support it, they produced the first inventory of greenhouse gases emissions for São Paulo. And what else? They categorize it by source and gas time. So it's nice. It gives you an idea of what gases we are emitting and where they are coming from. So it's a very complete document if you have some time to take a look. But even though we have this starter, we still don't have a plan to refine this framework. I think, at least I could not find. I have to confess I have a bit trouble with some of the websites we have for especially the state one. It has a lot of information, but sometimes you need to really look for it for a long time to find something. But it's all there at some point. So other relevant propositions of the state law are the execution of strategic environmental assessments in the sectorial point of view, but they are not all published yet. They are in development, and also the participative plan for adaptation to climate change is still being developed. I think the initial version is available on the website for the public consultation. I checked it a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it's nice that it's being produced, but maybe we need to rush that part a little bit when we have this sort of problem coming every now and then. So I think the problem here is just that we need to go to the updating phase and not only stay. So this is our result for the state, also not so good. So yeah, we need to improve that part a little bit. Maybe it's related a little bit to this updating moment, at least what I hope is an updating moment of legislation, or maybe our actions are not so good so far. But another problem that maybe is about accounting. I'll talk about it briefly when we conclude, after we go through the municipality. So the municipality level, so here we reached it. The world map is not appearing, but these are the ICLEI city, member cities. I think one nice thing about São Paulo is that when climate change started being discussing, we already joined transnational networks such as ICLEI. We participated in international events. So we started elaborating inventories early. I think the first one is with measures from 2003. So we are doing it for quite a while now. And we committed early to make this change. And I think that's one of the strong points of the city. So we already have a history with it. We can look back and have a longer look back and understand more where are we going with it. Oh, sorry, that's not what I want you to do. Anyways, after the inventory, it was sort of the basis for the elaboration of our laws and policies. So we identified the problems, what were our main sources, and etc. And based on that, we started developing policies and plans. It's more precise than the state and the national one, as it should be, because it's relating to a very specific case. And it also defines a lot of instruments to support the guidelines and incentive non-governmental actors to commit to climate change. It also talks about using greenhouse gases emissions as a parameter for developing plans for transportation, energy, waste management, health, etc. So that's a very nice thing. So only 2 years after the elaboration of the municipality's climate law, we are already talking about an action plan for mitigation and adaptation. So it's from 2011, this plan. It directs the municipality's efforts towards reducing GHG emissions and also having a more resilient city. So it talks about possible actions to optimize each sector mentioned in the municipal law, such as transportation, energy, and waste management. And since it also deals with climate change adaptation, it talks about some of its consequences. I think this graphic showed up before. It's from here, and it's from IAG, and it also shows in the guidelines. In it, you can see how much we have a change in our rain regimes. So we have more rain throughout the years, from 33 to 2014, and concentrated in a smaller number of days. So it pretty much sums up that idea of floodings and droughts getting more and more extremes. So this is one of the things that they use in those guidelines to justify the necessity to adapt. So, okay. Anyways, despite the high level of governmental activity and so on, we did not reach our goal yet. I mean, we have until 2020, and this is just from 2011, we need to update, but we didn't see that many changes in the time we were more active in terms of policies and legislation. So, don't know if you can hear me. Okay. So at this point, I would just like to comment a little bit about how the political situation here sort of influences it. The mandate that was more active in terms of legislation and so on was followed by another one, the one of HADAD, that in which there was no much international action. But if you think about it, it had a lot of initiatives that should be helping in this aspect, especially when you think that most of our emissions come from transportation, from the energy sector. I think it was about 75% of it came from transportation. So these local actions, even though there's not so much international action, let's say like this, should be helping, but we don't know. So let's think about how they have been working together. So our constitution defines that the environment is a shared responsibility. So all levels, the national, state, and municipality level, need to take care of it. So has some very nice points to it. So you can assess environmental issues from different perspectives and within different scales, which we saw is not only good but necessary. And it also makes it possible for people to participate. Because if you have a smaller scale, a smaller environment, people can actually have a say on what is done. I think we should maybe even go deeper than the municipal scale, as Andrea was talking about, the neighborhood scale at some point, because we will need, I think, more local actions, especially in the adaptation point of view. But on the other hand, this is also a little bit of a difficulty because it's a shared responsibility. So sometimes the lines may blur a little bit, and it's not clear in the national legislation how they should be working together. So this should be a bit improved. Also, at some point, maybe the federal boundaries may limit the other policies a little bit, especially when they are dealing with such different problems in the different scales. Okay, here I briefly talked about it, but we can also talk a little bit more specifically on the São Paulo scale about the initiatives, that the actual things that were done to try to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So in the mandate of Gilberto Kassab from 2006 to 2012, we had the development of policies and strategies, we had international events, we had also not that much of a reflection in the GHG emissions decrease. But on the next one, the climate change policies was sort of not a priority anymore. It participates in some plans or strategies, but it looks like a bit of a collateral effect. But on the other hand, some of the actions that were implemented are probably going to have a positive result because they deal with the main sources of emissions. So it's not that like this is a wrong approach, this is the right approach or anything. The idea would be to find a compromise and balance this international participation, this participation in networks with actual strategies, local strategies. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some specifically mitigation strategies. So the actions I'm going to talk about are focused on transportation and waste management, as they are most of our costs. The energy one, as you can see, 75% of it comes from transportation, the emissions, and about 50% of the total comes from waste management. So an example of what was done in the mitigation case was the Bandeirantes landfill. This is a famous case study. It was a CDM project. Methane was being used to produce electricity to the neighborhoods in São Paulo. It was funded by CDM, and it led to knowledge development, reduction of emissions, and profit, because we could sell carbon credits. So in this aspect, it was very positive, but it was still not enough to lower our emissions that much. Another mitigation sort of idea that's really nice was the mobility plan for São Paulo. If we take a look at the results of the Origin and Destiny census from 2007, we see that most of our transportation, our commutes, are by individual motorized vehicles. So a strategy to improve the quality of collective transportation and incentive the use of bicycles and walking commutes would be very valuable to reduce the emissions from the transportation. In the adaptations point of view, the strategic master plan for São Paulo, even though it's not specifically for that, the sort of environmental agenda they define to, in a lot of points, talk about mitigation and adaptation. When they talk about having more green areas and better maintenance, this would have a direct effect on the urban heat island effect. If we have more green areas, we'll have fresher areas. I mean, if you ever passed in front of a building with a green facade, you will notice the difference in temperature immediately. It's almost magical. So having these little changes, well, not that little change, if you think about parks and so on. But if you have this sort of changes, in a way or another, you are already helping with the adaptation to climate change. So in the end, what we learned was that scaling down the country's conditions does not generate a model of the conditions of the cities in it. The smaller cases with a limited number of stakeholders, synergistic solutions are more likely, and eventual trade-offs will have a limited impact. Those are the two most important points. What I said I would comment on the accounting point of view, I have not that many knowledge about how they model these emissions. What I have of an understanding is that they use the IPCC methodology, and in one aspect, this is a very good thing because it's a methodology that other places use, so you can share information and compare information. But on the other hand, you have to start analyzing and seeing if it is adequate to our case, to every case. One of the criticism I read a lot when I was researching for this was that, okay, it's good that we close this gap of different information reaching us, but sometimes the smaller actions, they cannot be accounted for using this methodology. So flexibility should be thought about as well. Anyways, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Camila. Questions? Everybody's hungry.
Probably.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to listen a little bit more about the participatory plan, the adaptation one from São Paulo. I didn't heard about it, and it's like I've been stuck it from like 7 years. So I'd like to know if you read the plan, if you know some people that are working on this.
The which one?
The participatory plan, the adaptation one from São Paulo that you mentioned.
Oh, the guidelines for mitigation and adaptation?
Yeah, the state.
I read the plan. I think they present some very good strategies. I don't know until which point they implement it. That's my doubt. I don't know. Being from here, I understand there's a really big gap between writing something in a paper and actually making it happen. And so I don't really know how to say how far it went in terms of actually making things happen. I think the one I read the most about is not specifically the guidelines, but it was about the ecofrota, you know, the changing on the fuel type for the public transportation fleet. Yeah, that was the one that I read that was postponed. And I saw a lot of controversy on it, reading about, I read a master thesis talking about how their choice about the biodiesel was maybe not the most effective one, and then that's why it had to be left behind afterwards because it was just the cheapest, not the most efficient. So it's really a messy affair, if you have to ask me.
One final question to Camila, if there is one. No? Thank you, Camila.